A very warm welcome to today's Franco-German Observatory of the Indo-Pacific. My name is Christian von Soest. I'm the head of GIGA's Peace and Security Research Program. And today we will be discussing East Africa, the Indo-Pacific's Western Perimeter. So a very warm welcome again. And before I introduce the speakers to you, let me make three organizational announcements. So we are into the third year of the Franco-German Observatory of the Indo-Pacific webinar. So you can find all the recordings of all past events on the website of the GIGA and also Sciences Po Série. That's the first announcement. Then the second announcement related to the first one is that we're gonna record this event just to let you know. And the third one is that you may, after the initial inputs, pose questions. And for that, you can use the chat. But I would like to remind you that the chat also is visible to everybody. Right, and with that, I'd like to introduce to you the main speakers who will be talking about East Africa and the topic of the Indo-Pacific's Western Perimeter. And the first speaker will be Tshegofatso Johanna Ramachela. She's a research consultant for the Maritime Project at the Institute for Security Studies in South Africa, in Pretoria. I may say, very close to my heart because I also was there a few years ago. She has an honors degree in international relations from the University of Pretoria, where she is currently completing her MA in international relations, specializing in security studies. She also is a research consultant on a project at the University of Pretoria's Department of Political Science, where her focus is on BRICS maritime security issues. So a very warm welcome to you, Tshegofatso. Great to have you. And the second speaker will be David Willima. He works as a research officer on maritime security at the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria as well. And before joining the ISS, David worked for the Environmental Learning and Research Center at Rhodes University in Grahamstown as a research assistant on the International One Ocean Hub research program for transformative ocean governance. And currently, he's studying towards an MA in Security Studies in the Department of Political Science at the University of Pretoria, and he focuses there on ocean governance in the Western Indian Ocean region. So a very warm welcome again. And then, of course, we have my co-moderator, Dr. David Cameroux from Série Sciences Po. And after the initial inputs from Tshegofatso and David, we will also have a brief input from him on also the African initiative to devise solutions to the war of aggression, Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. But we start with the initial inputs from Tshegofatso, and I'd like to hand over to you. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Christian. I'm just quickly going to share my slides. Please do let me know if they're visible to everyone. And are they visible?
Not yet.
They should be coming up any second now.
Yeah. That looks good.
Yes.
Yeah,
okay.
it's building up. Just a second.
Okay. Visible, yes?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Okay, so let me just dive straight into it. So I think when we speak about the Indo-Pacific, it's important to understand it firstly as a geographical region, as a geopolitical construct, and as a concept which has been constructed. In terms of its geography, the Indo-Pacific is understood as running from the eastern quadrant of the Pacific all the way to the western quadrant of the Indian Ocean, which is also referred to as the Western Indian Ocean. And it is inherently part of the Indo-Pacific. And I use the word inherently very intentionally because this view is sometimes contested. I just want to quote Dr. Abhishek Mishra, who recently, in a publication titled Reflections on the Indo-Pacific, Perspectives from Africa. And Dr. Mishra says, in many ways, the Indo-Pacific is a contested concept without much clarity on what falls within or outside the geopolitical space. And this brings me to my next point of how the Indo-Pacific is a geopolitical construct. And in this sense, it's viewed as having been constructed to serve the interests of certain countries and in turn, basically doing a disinterest or disadvantaging others. And I think when it comes to this point, we need to ask the question, what does the Indo-Pacific mean for Africa? And I think this is an area or a topic which requires much more research. Because up until recently, African countries have not featured very much in the discourse about the Indo-Pacific. So this here is the image which was used to publicize this webinar. And if you look at the circle on the map, it just cuts a little bit of Africa off there at the bottom. It includes a little bit of East Africa by the Horn of Africa, a bit of Tanzania, Madagascar, but it excludes the bottom half there of Southern Africa. And it's not just this image. If you do a Google search of a map of the Indo-Pacific, many of these maps tend to cut off Africa. They just stop short of India. That's around the Eastern Indian Ocean. And essentially, their African countries and their role in the Indo-Pacific, their presence has been, in a sense, excluded. It's been overlooked. Sometimes Africa is not mentioned at all in the discussions. But I think there's another side to this in which we also need to look to African countries. I think maybe there's perhaps a lack of agency on the part of African governments, and they are indeed falling behind. And this, I think, can be explained in terms of their priorities. The Indo-Pacific, specifically the Pacific part of it, it's perhaps not a key priority for African states at the moment. I think they're more concerned with their own maritime backyard. The Pacific is too far off from the African continent. Many African states do not have the capacity to send naval vessels to the Pacific. Often there is a difficulty in patrolling the areas outside their own exclusive economic zones, and sometimes even within their exclusive economic zones, within their territorial waters. And this is where usually coast guards would supplement these deficits, basically do the tasks that traditional navies are unable to carry out. These shortcomings, I guess, of traditional navies can also be supplemented with drones. Drones could perhaps act as force multipliers. This is another area of my research, which I do with our colleague Dennis Riva. In a sense, we look to how drones can act as force multipliers and play a complementary role to traditional navies and coast guards. But essentially, where African countries are concerned, those along the Western Indian Ocean, in terms of their limited naval capacity, external actors have basically stepped up to fill this vacuum. So there's been a large presence, a large deployment and ongoing maintained presence of foreign vessels in the Western Indian Ocean. This has since been scaled down since the height of Somali piracy. However, the presence remains quite significant. And with this comes some geopolitical challenges. So firstly, when we talk about the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific, specifically the Western Indo-Pacific or the Western Indian Ocean, first, I think it's important to note the vast number of military bases in Djibouti, from those of the US, the UK, Germany, France, Italy, Japan, I think Saudi Arabia, China recently established their very own, and I know India and Russia too would like to establish military bases. So there is no shortage of interests. And of course, there's no doubt that the war in Ukraine has diverted attention away from the Western Indian Ocean. However, I think the interest remains strong. Great powers are particularly present in the region, especially where the small island developing states of the Western Indian Ocean or Southwestern Indian Ocean are concerned. essentially all these big powers have they have a piece of the cake. And I hate to put it this way, but I think it's the reality. They all have some sort of chunk in the Western Indian Ocean, some sort of vested interest. It seems like a maritime scramble for the Western Indian Ocean. To briefly break it down, we have the UK and the controversy with the disputed Chagos Islands and the ownership of Mauritius and its sovereign rights to the island. There's the United States, which has since scaled down its presence in the Western Indian Ocean to focus on other regions, namely the Asia-Pacific. This would be around East Asia, the Straits of Taiwan, the South China Sea. And I think in this sense, the United States has looked to India to act as a sort of security guarantor in the region and as a sort of counterbalance to China, to India, yes, to China. And then when we look at India as well, it also plays a very key role with the small island developing states, specifically with Mauritius, the Maldives, and even Seychelles. And it's been quite strategic in using its soft diplomacy tools in terms of using its shared history and to some extent its shared culture with these island states. When we turn to China, I think China has more engagement with the islands in the Pacific than those in the Western Indian Ocean. However, it does have massive engagement and partnerships with the littoral countries of the Western Indian Ocean. And this is more so in terms of its Belt and Road Initiative and related projects. It has made huge investments in these infrastructure projects in, I think, about 46 ports in Africa, and 4 of those are situated along the Western Indian Ocean. In South Africa, in Durban, in Beira, in Mozambique, in Tanzania, and in Djibouti as well. And then the other big player that we need to mention is France, which is, I think, perhaps the main external player in the Western Indian Ocean. It is now a full-fledged member of the Indian Ocean Rim Association, also known as the IORA, and it has a significant economic exclusive zone, not only in the Indian Ocean, but in the Pacific as well, what it calls its French overseas departments. This, in the Western Indian Ocean, this includes Europa, Tromalin, Bassas de India, Mayotte, and most notably La Réunion. And Mayotte, of course, is also another big one. And these scattered islands remain highly contested, especially when you look at Mayotte and the ongoing dispute there with the island of the Comoros. But these are just some key points, I think, to note when we speak about the geopolitics of the Western Indian Ocean. But clearly, there is a big interest in this region for external powers, not only to compete militarily in terms of their naval strength, I guess, but also to project that influence in the region, in the maritime space, but also on the African continent. But with this in mind, I think we need to ask, what role do African countries play? Where do they fit in the grand strategies, the plans, and the agendas of these external actors? And so David and I did a bit of a scoping of the different Indo-Pacific strategies and policies of that some big powers have put out there. And among the countries that have Indo-Pacific strategies and policies, we noted Germany, France, Australia, Canada, Japan, the United States, and even regional organizations such as the European Union and ASEAN. And I just want to skip to the next slide here. So when we speak about the Western Indian Ocean, just to give you an idea, that's the light blue square over there. And just to the next one. So these are some of the strategies that we came across. These are some of the images that I've put up here. And only the strategies of France and Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific strategy mention Africa. Again, I just want to quote Dr. Mishra, and he writes that while the US's concept of the Indo-Pacific excludes Africa, countries like India, France, and Japan acknowledge the centrality of African states within their Indo-Pacific strategies. African countries are primarily mentioned in the context of challenges like countering terrorism, alleviating poverty, in terms of sustainable development, as well as energy and food security. If you look at the covers of these of these strategies, the first one, that's France's Indo-Pacific strategy, it does include the eastern coast of Africa. If you look at the one in the center, that's the strategy of the United States. It cuts off at the eastern Indian Ocean and excludes the western side of it. And then that last one there is just a cover page from a publication about the Indo-Pacific. And again, it highlights only up until India and leaves out the rest of the western Indian Ocean. So we can see how from these strategies, publications, sometimes Africa is left out. But I think there's also a flip side to this as well. It goes back to that agency of African countries, because when it comes to African countries with Indo-Pacific strategies and papers, their stances, it seems that not much is happening. And like I said, I think it also does go back to a matter of priorities, what it is that African countries' governments are prioritizing for the moment. I think when it comes to the island states in the Western Indian Ocean, I think they've perhaps been more vocal or active when it comes to the Indo-Pacific. And this was evident in the last two Indo-Pacific ministerial forums, the one held in France in 2022 and the most recent one in Stockholm in Sweden in 2023 this year. And we're finding it difficult to obtain a list of the attendees, specifically the African countries. But I think it's safe to assume that some of the Western Indian Ocean island states were in attendance because the oceans and ocean governance, blue economy, climate, those are very important topic for the island states. However, we can confirm that South Africa was absent from both of these events. Just going back to Indo-Pacific strategies and policies, when it comes to the regional economic communities situated along the Western Indian Ocean, this is the IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority for Development, the East African Community, the SADC, the Southern African Development Community. They do not have Indo-Pacific strategies, and neither does the regional economic community known as the Indian Ocean Commission. However, France is a member of the IOC, and it has included the Indo-Pacific as part of its agenda as a member of the IOC. At the AU level, we once again did scoping, David and I, of AU documents. And from the Agenda 2063 to the 2050 African Integrated Maritime Strategy, also referred to as the AIMS, to even the recently released Blue Economy Strategy, they don't mention the Indo-Pacific. The main focus seems to be on the Western Indian Ocean, the Gulf of Guinea, time to time the Red Sea, the Mediterranean, but not the Indo-Pacific as a whole, just the Indian Ocean side of it. The one organization, however, which has been, I guess, more active in terms of the Indo-Pacific is the IORA, the Indian Ocean Rim Association. They recently published a vision on the Indo-Pacific, also referred to as its outlook on the Indo-Pacific. It was adopted at the 22nd Council of Ministers meeting in Dhaka, Bangladesh. This was sometime last year, I think in November, late November. And the outlook is intended to guide IORA's engagement and cooperation with the broader Indo-Pacific region. This includes with regional organizations in this region. I know that the African bloc of the IORA, which comprises 9 countries, together with the rest of the IORA members, will be convening a meeting on the 23rd and 24th of this month of June in order to reflect on the IORA's Indo-Pacific outlook. So once again, I think it's clear that although African countries perhaps don't have individual Indo-Pacific strategies, on a multilateral level, there is indeed interest and there is potential for enhanced engagement with the Indo-Pacific region. So I just want to end off with 3 key points. And the first is that for African states and the IORA as a whole and the African bloc within the Indian Ocean Rim Association, I think it's a priority for them to ensure that they're not drawn into a geopolitical chess match in the Indo-Pacific and within the Western Indian Ocean. And if they are, I think it should be on their own terms. my second point is that it's clear that there are many challenges within the Western Indian Ocean, which require joint and coordinated efforts to resolve. I mean, besides the geopolitical tensions, there are various non-traditional maritime security challenges, which I'm sure David will touch on, but they range from piracy and armed robbery to maritime terrorism, mostly in the Gulf of Aden, Gulf of Oman, the Red Sea. There's illegal, unreported and unregulated, or IUU fishing in the Western Indian Ocean, specifically in the Horn of Africa and the Mozambique Channel, transnational organized crime, climate change, and so on. So there is no shortage of issues on which cooperation is possible and in fact necessary between the littoral states and island states in the Western Indian Ocean and countries in the greater Indo-Pacific region. And I think just finally, the focus should not be on competition, but rather on cooperation, as there are many opportunities for cooperation, particularly where the blue economy is concerned and the potential it holds not only for the Western Indian Ocean, but all maritime countries in the world. But on that note of the blue economy, I think I'll hand over to David. Yeah, please go ahead.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tshegofatso. With that, I'd like to hand over to David. David, please.
Thanks, Christian. Thanks, Tshegofatso, for laying the foundation with that approach. And I think that the way we approached this presentation was to show that maritime security and the blue economy are two sides of the same coin. And so as a point of departure, if you look at from what Tshegofatso was saying about African countries not wanting to be caught in a geopolitical competitive space unless on their own terms, you can juxtapose the perceptions of countries in the Western Indian Ocean region, particularly countries like Kenya and Tanzania. I think they've been quite strategic in their approach, for example, with China, to develop their ports for development. And that shows the opportunities that lie in this space for African countries. It is despite there not being a coordinated approach in terms of policy frameworks. The Indo-Pacific is a region of great importance as it is home to some of the world's most populous and dynamic economies, China, India, Japan, and Australia. And there's been growing interest from the United States that are seeking to deepen their engagement and partnerships with the continent. And Africa, too, has an important role to play in this region, and it is essential that Africa develops a clear approach and priorities for its engagement in the region, just to echo what Tshegofatso was saying. And so I think for me, Africa's place in the Indo-Pacific is significant for several reasons. First, most of the continent's trading partners, including China, India, Japan, are in this region. These countries are major importers of African commodities, oil, minerals, agriculture products, and also important sources of investment and development assistance. But secondly, the Indo-Pacific is a critical transit route of African goods, with many of Africa's major ports located in this region. And this is important also for our landlocked countries because they use these corridors to export and import goods. And then thirdly, the region is also home to a large and growing African diaspora with significant populations, South Africa, Mauritius, Madagascar. And I think, David, if you remember at the UP event, Tshegofatso and I spoke about Africa's projected population growth, with 60% of our population being youth below 25. And we need to start thinking about what that means going forward and for this region. There are several opportunities, whether it's cadets, shipbuilding, coast guards and things like that. And so given Africa's strategic importance in the Indo-Pacific. It is essential that as a continent, we in the region, we do develop a clear approach and priorities for engagement. And one key priority could be to deepen economic ties with the region's major economies. This could involve negotiating new trade agreements, attracting investments, and protecting African ports and our exports as well. And African countries then should seek to leverage their natural resources and geographic location to become key players in the region's supply chains, particularly in the energy, agriculture, and manufacturing sectors. And you see this sort of blue economy approach becoming a key feature of the AU-EU partnership, for example. But of course, that is not without controversy, because the EU has been implicated in a lot of maritime crime in African waters, i.e. fishing, particularly there's recent reports of that happening, especially with tuna species in the Western Indian Ocean region. So again, while that is a challenge, it creates an opportunity for cooperation, especially with small island states or large ocean states, as they prefer to be called. And so another priority for Africa in the Indo-Pacific could be to strengthen its maritime capabilities. I think Tshegofatso spoke a lot about this, by investing in port infrastructure, developing a strong naval presence, and enhancing maritime security cooperation with other countries in the region. And given the importance of the Indian Ocean for global trade and security, Africa has a crucial and critical role in ensuring the vital waterways safety and security. And you see this in the Gulf of Aden and Mozambique more recently becoming security hotspots, because again, these are crucial for global supply chains, but also they are involved in domestic security issues that perhaps require external assistance in that regard. So the other thing that I wanted to just briefly touch on, I think Tshegofatso was speaking about the IOC. And when you look at the member states of the IOC in the region, the reason it was formed is because small island states are not, their development needs, or rather the security and development needs usually are not prioritized at the African Union level, because they are somewhat different from mainland Africa. And so this intergovernmental organization comprised, I think, exclusively of island states, besides France, I guess. It has enabled countries in this region to focus on the interests and challenges. And I think that is a strong sign of agency from an African perspective to pursue interests in this region. And then there is also an opportunity to deepen cultural and people-to-people ties within the region by investing in tourism, educational exchanges, and cultural diplomacy. I think countries like Seychelles are doing a great job at advancing this kind of approach. But then again, in conclusion with that, I think a summary would be that African countries need to define their national interests and power capabilities, taking stock of that, and take clear positions on the Indo-Pacific in line with Agenda 2063 as the lighthouse that the continent uses to navigate the Indo-Pacific seascape, because that provides a blueprint for the next 50 years of Africa's development agenda. And failure to do so from our side will, through inaction, or being caught in geopolitical rivalries, like Tshegofatso said, could affect the continent's long-term prosperity and interests. So in terms of how other powers should engage with Africa, to just go back a bit. I guess it would be based on this, we can tell that Africa's priorities and interests in the Indo-Pacific would not be heavily security focused or security for the sake of security, but they would want to approach it in a way that advances the economic interests, at the same time helps them deal with the various security issues that feature across this region. And so I think other powers should focus on building partnerships that are based on mutual respect, trust, and shared interests. And there's plenty of opportunities for this. They should work together to promote economic development, trade, and investment in Africa. The US, for example, has the Prosper Africa program, which seeks to promote trade and investment between the US and Africa. And there is a way also to take advantage of the African Continental Free Trade Area to pursue this agenda, and also to work within the AU's peace and security architecture, which seeks to promote peace and security on the continent, and also use the African Integrated Maritime Strategy as a way to forge this partnership. And then when you look at the pressing issues, when you speak of securitization theory, we understand piracy and all these issues are heavy, and also the geopolitics that are in the region. But climate change adaptation would be very critical, because most of the countries from an African perspective within this region face threats from climate change. Mauritius, I think, is one of the countries that is listed to be under threat from sea level rises. So in terms of coastal infrastructure, we can use, this is a region that has been targeted for green shipping corridor. So how can countries in this region cooperate to promote global decarbonization of the shipping industry, for example, or to promote jobs for Africa's youthful population. And so if you look at the activities in this region, there's oil and gas exploration, particularly in the Mozambique Channel, which is also now heavily under facing security issues, shipping traffic, unchecked coastal developments, mangrove deforestation, IUU fishing, and the impact of this then as sea level rises, food insecurity, depletion of biodiversity. And this is why the High Seas Treaty, which was adopted just yesterday, which is great news, present an opportunity for international cooperation as well, to be a key feature of the Indo-Pacific conversation. Tshegofatso, if you may, please. Thank you. So we're using one pair of slides. And so an example.
No problem, David. If I may just briefly, if you could come to a conclusion within the next minutes, that would be great, because then we could also tackle like additional points in the Q&A.
Cool. So just a last example that I wanted to give is the Great Blue War Initiative, which is an initiative of 10 countries in the Western Indian Ocean region, including France, to protect 30% of the ocean by 2030 by unlocking the development of a regenerative blue economy and promoting blue entrepreneurships opportunities that seek to balance economic gain and conservation efforts. So that kind of approach, I think, would be a great avenue for cooperation. And there is countries that we can learn from in the Pacific region of things. I had the pleasure of going to Palau for our ocean conference last year, and they're the first country on earth to change the immigration laws to for the cause of environmental protection. You sign a pledge at the point of entry to not act in any way that will harm the environment and the ocean. This is the pledge here. And so, yeah, in terms of the African outlook, opportunities, and how global powers can engage with Africa, I think that gives us a well-rounded approach that balances the security side and the development side. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, David. So we spoke about like the security implications and also economic and even environmental implications. Before we open up the discussion, I would like to give the word now to David, who will be speaking about like Africa's diplomatic initiatives. Please.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I can be seen. I seem to have disappeared. Activate the camera.
Yeah, I cannot see you, David.
All right. Can you see me now?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, we can see you. Great.
Okay. Thanks very, very much to Tshegofatso and to David for I think, a very complete and comprehensive view of looking at the Indo-Pacific from Eastern Africa. We've only come to talk about Africa in our third year of webinars, and it's an incredible reflection of how the African view has been very much neglected, not only in Europe but throughout all of the countries of the Indo-Pacific. In the presentations that you've given, I've summarized it in terms of 4 A's. The first A is absence, the second A is agency, the third A is architecture, and the fourth A is assertiveness. Well, the first A about absence and how, as you can see on the maps that you've shown, how the eastern coast of Africa, not only the continental states of Africa, but the large island states are not included in many of the views that we have of the Indo-Pacific. And the second point you raised was, the second A was agency, that it is the African countries themselves, including the large island states, who have had other priorities in terms of their own development. However, as you point out, this is changing, and that's the fourth A, which is assertiveness. The third A that you touch across is architecture, as in regional architecture. And what I found fascinating and a subject for further research is to compare the ASEAN outlook of the Indo-Pacific with the outlook, and it's interesting the word outlook is presented, it's not strategy, it's an outlook that you mentioned of the Indian Ocean Rim Association that's just published. I think it'd be interesting to compare those two. And I see some parallels here of Africa and the large island states in relation to the Indo-Pacific, to the South Pacific countries in relation to Eastern Asia. Just rapidly, this has an implication for who is given responsibility. I was fascinated you made the point that you get the impression that the US is now subcontracting, looking after the Indian Ocean to India. And this is related to the third A of regional architecture, that the Quad arrangement between Australia, the United States, Japan, and the US actually does involve a division of labor between those two countries, and how this regional architecture, the Quad, which is about, as you mentioned, dealing with in relation to China, also has implications for East Africa. And also, one sees the same kind of tension between the South Pacific and East Asia as the island states against the other parts of Africa. That in the South Pacific, the US kind of has made Australia and New Zealand the kind of deputy sheriff. And I wonder if that now the US is now making India the kind of the deputy sheriff to deal with the Indian Ocean. And my fourth and final point is that you made is assertiveness, that this is changing, that because of the existential threats of climate change and questions about maritime trade, sea lanes, etc., that we're now seeing, as you pointed out, perhaps coming late to the party, but better late than never in terms of having inputting into reflections on the Indo-Pacific. So that's my brief summary, but just my question is the view that there is this subcontracting going on in relation to India and the US, do you think that that is a reasonable kind of interpretation?
Could I perhaps answer?
Yeah, maybe Tshegofatso first. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, David, for your inputs and your question as well. And I like the 4 A's that you noted. But to answer your question, of course, I cannot be sure that the United States is subcontracting out to India in the Western Indian Ocean. It's interesting that you mentioned the Australians in New Zealand and the South Pacific and perhaps Japan in the East Pacific and East Asia. And then we look to India and the Western Indian Ocean. We can't be sure. And just judging based on India, its foreign policy and how it projects itself out there in the world, it's based on its foreign policy, India does not seem like the type of country to perhaps take orders. It will do what it wants to do, it will serve its national interests. And so in terms of acting as a counterbalance to China, I don't think perhaps it's maybe subcontracted by the United States, but I think it is very much within its own interest as well to sort of balance out how China is projecting its own influence into the Indian Ocean. And perhaps this then aligns with what the United States would ideally like to see. So not necessarily India being sent out like an attack dog, but doing what is serving its own national interests within the Indian Ocean. But it would be quite interesting to do a comparison as well between how the Quad, how the individual Quad members operate within their own spheres, their own maritime spheres, and how maybe they have endeavored or to, in a sense, counterbalance China and see what drives that.
Yeah. David, you have?
Yeah, maybe just briefly, the 4 A's are really interesting and I love them. I actually wrote them down. But with respect to your question, there is a perception that the US perhaps has taken its eyes off the Indo-Pacific. And in that context, you could, I guess the argument that it's now relying on its allies and now more increasingly India in this respect. It has water, it holds some water there. I'm not sure to what extent. It will be interesting to observe that, but truly speaking, it is, I guess, relying on its allies like it's done before in the Pacific Islands, like you pointed out. So that is a critical observation that I guess we'll have to be on the lookout for going forward. Thanks, David.
Great. So I'd like to invite you now. If you have questions, please just write them in the chat. We would be very happy to take them up and discuss them. And I also have a question for you. So you spoke about the neglect, I guess, on both sides. So also like the those Asian actors not really focusing much on African countries when they speak about or think about even about the Indo-Pacific. But maybe you can say a bit more on the other side, like the African side. So can you say a bit more about initiatives or how you see moves in the direction to put more emphasis on the Indo-Pacific direction, maybe even in relation to security, but also economy. So can you say a bit more about the African perspective here? Maybe David first.
Okay, we're gonna switch it around. Thanks, Christian. In terms of African perspectives, it is quite unfortunate that, like Tshegofatso and myself pointed out, it hasn't featured yet in key documents. So it is difficult to drive it at perhaps summit level. The small island states are really driving this conversation in a major way. And perhaps one of the things that we're positioned to do as the ISS, being a think tank with some policy leverage to drive policy in this continent, is that we've been trying to, especially now in partnership with the University of Pretoria and perhaps GIGA, we can push this conversation within the regional economic communities. I think that is the best approach to take, because then you have a member state to the EAC, and I guess within IORA and the IOC as well, to drive it up to the African Union. And so last year we held, after the colloquium at the University of Pretoria, we held a round table with African and non-African Indo-Pacific countries to discuss Africa's position in this. And the discussions were very fruitful. So these are permanent missions to South Africa. So we hope to take that conversation forward. As it stands, it doesn't paint a really positive picture in terms of Africa's engagement in the Indo-Pacific, but there is a lot of appetite, a lot of drive for this, and I think there is room to do a lot of work in this field. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I guess I'll just add to what David has said, and I really do agree that I think agree with David that I think the best way to approach or just promote Africa's cooperation with the broader Indo-Pacific region would be to go through the regional economic communities, because I think it's sort of like a stepping stone, like the building blocks to the African Union. So to start with smaller, more sub-regional strategies, which when combined would, I guess, speak to the continental goals. But I have it on good authority that there are efforts underway within specific government departments in South Africa to formulate a similar Indo-Pacific outlook like that of the IORA, because South Africa, being a member of the IORA, did play a key role in issuing that outlook. So there are efforts underway to draft something similar, not a strategy per se, but an outlook or a vision per se. But yeah, I think it's the best way to go about this would be through the regional economic communities, as opposed to individual African states drafting their own Indo-Pacific strategies, because as it stands, sometimes even national strategies do not align with regional ones or even the continental ones. Yeah.
And just to add on to that, something really quick that came to mind, the reason RECs, regional economic communities, also offer the best approach is that the African Union works on the principle of subsidiarity. So the RECs have first responsive priority to security issues within the continent. So within this specific conversation, the RECs would be the #1 respondents and then drive it up to the African Union. So I think that adds to reasons why RECs would be the best approach. Yeah. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. David Camus, you wanted to come in here?
Unless there are other questions, I just, if there are no other questions, I wanted to come back.
Maybe a second to our organizational team, Lisa from our organizational team. I cannot quite see the chats, so please do let me know if there are questions and messages. I see a hand. So the way this talk is organized, this event is organized, if you could like write your question into the chat, that would be great, and we would be extremely happy to take it up. Please, David.
Well, while waiting for Friedrich's question, I wanted to come back to the point that Tshegofatso made about not wanting to be part of a geopolitical game, chess game. And we find echoes of this in Southeast Asia. You know, Sino-American rivalry, the lens of Sino-American rivalry is putting other political leaderships in a situation where they don't want to have to choose. Is this, given, you know, China's economic importance in Africa, how much pressure is there from the United States, or, you know, for countries, in fact, to choose in the context of Sino-American rivalry?
That's a fantastic question, David. Thank you for that. I think African countries truly do not want to choose. They want to toe the line. And I think this is most predominantly seen with South Africa, but I think with most African countries throughout the continent, they would like to still be a partner with the United States, but also a partner with China. I think the issue comes in where perhaps there is the perception that there is perhaps when the United States or when some European countries present strategies and agendas to the African continent, they are viewed as intended to counter China's activities on the continent. And thus, I think from this standpoint, questions arise about the true motives of these strategies. Whereas on the flip side of it, when the investments come from China with regards to its Belt and Road Initiative, these initiatives or these strategies are viewed as or presented rather on the basis of mutual benefit, as beginning on an equal footing. And I think for African countries, they don't want to have to choose between the two. They would rather cooperate with the United States, cooperate with China, regardless of whatever tensions they may have with each other, and see how they can best leverage that to their advantage and their development. I don't know, David, perhaps you have something you want to add to that.
No, fully agree. I think for most African countries, it's about balancing the two. How you do that, I think, is another matter that can be discussed. But there is a general approach and view that most African countries tend to have on a lot of issues that seem to be caught up in this US-China geopolitical space. But also, both countries present opportunities in terms of national interests, whether from an economic perspective or security perspective. And that is why I think most African countries are like, please do not involve us in your chess match. We would like to work with both, but also the narrative that China is Africa's biggest economic partner is quite false. A lot of European countries are actually bigger economic partners. So I guess it's about who's saying what as well in that regard. So yeah, thanks.
Hi, I'm sorry, I just wanted to add one more thing, I guess, to what David has said.
Sure.
And just on the point of geopolitics and just geopolitical competition, and when we look back to the Indo-Pacific, I think maybe we should consider two questions. And that conceptually, I think we should consider, what does the Indo-Pacific now mean, you know, as a concept, a geopolitical construct, as a region, since the whole idea of regions is also sort of like shifting, you know, what defines a region? Is it geography? Is it maintaining a presence? Is it the recognition from the people in that region, from states in that region? But what does the Indo-Pacific now mean in light of the war in Ukraine, but also with African countries towing the line? I think another thing we need to consider is, what is the role, if any, what role does BRICS play in the Indo-Pacific? You know, given that all the BRICS members are maritime countries, and we have Russia in there, China, we have India, these big powers as well. What is their role in the Indo-Pacific, if any? So yeah, just those two key points.
Okay, so here we have a question from Frederic Catois. in how far African countries are interested in the legal issue of scattered islands and the Diego Garcia issue. The latter played a role in the recent conflict Mauritius Maldives at Itlas. You have thoughts on that? Like, who would be?
Is the question about Africa's role in dispute settlements?
Maybe we can bring in Frederic Catois briefly. Just you may just open your microphone and just explain a little bit the question. Frederic Catois.
I think it has to do with the dispute over the Chagos Islands with the American base and Diego Garcia. Tshegofatso mentioned that the Americans have reduced their presence on Diego Garcia, which is very important during the Gulf War. But it's certainly an issue, the issue of the British Indian overseas territories, and the decision by, I think it's the International Court of Justice, which was not favorable to Britain, on the contrary, suggesting the islands needed to be returned to Mauritius, which was the promise at the time of independence. So I think it's, what is the African view from the other players in Africa on that dispute?
Okay, I think I went back to read what he was saying, and I think Diego Garcia is quite interesting. There's a few of those. I think the Mauritius Maldives situation also comes with, I think that's the example that he gives with the International Tribunal, the law of the sea. Diego Garcia is interesting because even with the ICJ ruling, I think it was leased out to the US for about 50 years more. So even with that sort of withdrawal of US presence, it still is in effect a US base. And then in terms of African capacity to deal with disputes such as those, as mentioned, the one that is at Itlos now, we've been, and we see this with Somalia, Kenya as well, there in the Gulf of Aden. The African Union at present doesn't have the capacity to, because the approach rather, and we've done some research on this, project lead Timothy Walker, we ideally would like a situation where the AU's Africa Border Program is capacitated to be the first respondent to deal with such issues before they're escalated to the ICJ. Because in any case, when the ICJ gives a ruling, there's always controversies with one party disputing it or saying it's a colonial code and things like that. But the AU at present doesn't have the capacity to deal with these things. I understand efforts are in place to build the capacity of the AU's border program to be able to respond to this. And also it calls for a revitalization of sorts of UNCLOS itself to be updated to deal with these issues, especially within the context of sea level rises that will now make maritime delineation more difficult, because the borders become even more arbitrary as land is disappearing within the sea. So how is that going to look like? But UNCLOS, because it was, developed a long time ago, doesn't feature some of these emerging issues like climate change. And so that calls for a revitalization of that process as well.
Great, thank you. So we're coming to an end. I don't see further questions here. So I'd like to ask the esteemed speakers, do you have a final point to make, something which has not been mentioned? Then please go ahead, David Tshegofatso. The final point which should be made when we speak about Africa's position in the Indo-Pacific. No, I don't. Yeah, David.
Well, I'll ask a question to them both. So what is the place of Europe in all this, seen from Africa? You talked about France, which is a resident power in some of the islands. But what is your view of the place of Europe in African positioning in relation to the Indo-Pacific?
Apologies, David's screen is just frozen, so he's joined me at this.
Yeah, I was surprised to see him twice. Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, so
sorry,
brief answer is appreciated, but important question nonetheless, of course.
Yeah,
crucial question.
I'll try to keep it brief, but I think the role of Europe and the rest of the world really is to just, I think, offer more support to African countries. And I think from the side of African countries, firstly, I think they need to clearly articulate their positions on the Indo-Pacific. They need to take some sort of stance or determine which issues in the Indo-Pacific, which areas they need to give attention to. And from there, I think European partners, even the Asian partners can begin to sort of support that and find areas for collaboration on which they can cooperate. David, maybe you...
Yeah, no, I agree with Seko. I think the skepticism with cooperation with the EU is warranted given the history. And so I think forging any sort of cooperation within maritime security spaces or the blue economy has to be done in an equitable way, a mutually beneficial partnership. And I think that conversation is taking place, which is good to see. And yeah, so I think there is a lot of room for cooperation, and we look forward to the opportunities.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much to the audience for participating in this event on a neglected issue, or oftentimes neglected issue, Africa's role in the Indo-Pacific. So I guess there are a lot of questions which need to be tackled also in the future. I'd like to also thank, of course, our esteemed speakers. So Tshegofatso Ramachela, thank you very much for your participation. Then also David Kamaru, of course, and then also David Willima, sorry. And then also our organizational team here, Lisa Voike. And of course, for this particular event, our cooperation partner, Sciences Po Série. And with that, I'd like to thank you very much and say goodbye to you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Goodbye.